chapter 10, about verse 19, which is, it's interesting. There's two structural things to this section here. One is the repetition of a particular phrase that holds this section together. I'm loud. Hello, hello. And the other thing is there's two bookends of the section. In other words, it opens with a particular theme and it ends with a particular theme. And so that's why I have Isaiah chapter 9 verse 8 through chapter 10 verse 19. As you know, I look at structure dictates to me interpretation. And so how the message is laid out, how the book is laid out, is significant because it provides the I think the keys or the clues to how it is to be understood. So this is what I want to focus on, and we sort of began Isaiah 9 verses 8 through 12 last Sunday, but we really didn't go into depth in anything. But so I want to back up and try to finish this study together with you this morning. As far as the historical background, we've already gone through Ahaz and his mistake in not trusting in God, and as a result of his lack of faith, he and even the southern kingdom of Judah has been under threat. They have suffered lots of consequences of his lack of faith in God. He's made alliances with other, people against God's counsel. And so God has sort of, in a real sense, written him off. I mean, he's okay, if you're not going to listen, then, yes, is there something wrong? What if members is playing with the lights of the auditorium over here? So, would y'all settle down? Y'all settle down. I forgot what I was talking about now. See if y'all were listening. What was I talking about? No. Okay, yeah. Ahaz, a total failure, mess up. And as a result, the kingdom of Judah, southern kingdom, as well as, those around him, they're suffering hardship. Because you remember there's some foreign powers that have threatened him. God said that, he would protect them, but Ahaz chose not to trust God. So there's been some incursions and a lot of deaths that have happened because of the Syrians and the kingdom of northern Israel. So Ahaz's kingdom, his reign, has a big, black blotch on it. It hasn't been good, and the people have suffered as a result of his lack of faith. Now, God is raising up the Assyrians, and they're going to come from the north along the Fertile Crescent and down into the northern kingdom of Israel. And in 722 BC, they make it all the way down and they conquer the northern kingdom and take people away into captivity. This is the background. Before this actually happens, what we're going to read is what God is going to say about that punishment. Okay? So what's interesting is to understand the background gives a lot of meaning to what Isaiah's message is. And we are told what the issues are in northern Israel. And unfortunately, the kingdom of Judah will get into this trap, later on. But for right now, the Assyrians are the top dog. They're the nation. They've come and they've already conquered several cities as they come through the northern kingdom of Israel. Now, the section we're about to read is a section on judgment. It's going to be a message of judgment against Israel, northern kingdom, and then it's going to be a message of judgment against the punisher, Assyria. Kind of interesting. God is using this, Assyria as a paddle, a punishing rod against his people in North Israel. But that doesn't excuse the accountability that Assyria has to God. And so they will, in turn, be punished for their sins. One, in the issue of both is a simple explanation. It's not difficult to see. It is very simple as to why these two kingdoms come to an end. Northern Israel and the Assyrians. It has to do with pride, the arrogance of human beings. And that will form what we might call the bookends, what begins this section and what ends it, as a tight unit. Okay? So that's where we are. Let's look in Isaiah chapter 9 and verse 8. This comes after God is already making preparations for a new king that's arising that will have a different heart than Ahaz. And that new king that is emerging as the one who will show a different spirit will be Hezekiah. He'll be totally different. And so after this celebration of this wonderful counselor and this mighty warrior and this Prince of Peace is, extolled, and we have this language of great celebration of the new installation of a king, that's put on hold, because we'll get to Hezekiah, the narrative about him, a little bit later. It's put on hold, and now God is stepping back and saying, this is why Israel is going to fall. So we have the Lord sends a message. This is verse 8. The Lord sends a message against Jacob, and it falls on Israel, and all the people know it. That is Ephraim and the inhabitants of Samaria. Okay, if you weren't clear with the first phrase, identity, then there's another one, and then there's another identity, and then there's another one. Notice all the references describing northern Israel. Who are they? Well, it's Jacob. We have Israel. We have Ephraim. And we have the inhabitants of Samaria. That's all referring to the northern kingdom. And so, the reason of the repetition is to bring emphasis to it. There's judgment to northern Israel. And he says, and here's the reason. This is the foundational reason out of which other sins are committed. This is the foundation. He says, asserting in pride and in arrogance of heart. That's the foundation. Now he's going to tell you what they're asserting, what their response is to any message from Isaiah about approaching judgment, or northern Israel, if you don't straighten up, God's going to punish you. Well, in their arrogance and in their pride, they're going to respond. This is their response of impending doom. So the foundation is arrogance and pride. And because of their arrogance and pride, they say, the bricks have fallen down, but we will rebuild with smooth stones. Okay, think about this. All right, everybody's been saying we're going to be demolished. Well, let it come, because that'll give us an opportunity to rebuild and make it even better. Okay? That's the attitude of how northern Israel is represented. So in that attitude, what's the problem? What didn't they learn? the reason for their fall. See, they're asserting these things in response to God's prophetic message, and they have aligned themselves with the Syrians against the southern kingdom, and we're not paying attention to any predictions or prophecies, any prophet that comes from Judah about our, identity and our purpose and our inhabitants and our kingdom, because we're great. And so let it come. If we're wiped out, we'll rebuild and we'll make it bigger. He continues and says, the sycamores have been cut down, all right, but we will replace them with cedars. Y'all see the arrogance in that? I mean, what he's saying in response to God. Okay, this is, come on, you knock the sycamores down, we'll go to another place and we'll get different kind of trees. So, in other words, they have set themselves up as rebellious kingdom against God. They have, by their actions, actually denied God's sovereignty, power, and all of this. They're mocking the very thing for the prophet Isaiah or anybody else to warn us of any approaching danger. Verse 11, therefore the Lord raises against them adversaries from Rezin and spurs their enemies on. The Arameans on the east and the Philistines on the west, and they devour Israel with gaping jaws. Now, this is interesting because the people that North Israel is aligned with will end up being their own enemies. It's what we might refer to in the New Testament. Paul writes to the Galatians who were bickering and biting. He says, you're fighting and you're bickering. Be careful lest you consume one another. Okay? So the alliances that northern Israel has made with foreign powers for protection is going to be their downfall, because they're not going to be able to depend on these smaller nations, because once the smaller nations are threatened, they're going to say phooey to you, and they're going in preservation mode and, attacking one another. So who's going to arise as the champion of the area? Well, the Assyrians, they're going to take all of it. They come down, they take Syria, they take the northern kingdom, Damascus, all the little places, the citadels of this area are going to be mentioned as the places, the key places that were conquered, will be conquered by the Assyrians. So, he says the Arameans on the east, Philistines on the west, they'll devour Israel with, notice, see the language. I love the language of the Old Testament. You got a gaping jaws, kind of like when I was preaching in Tallahassee, you had the Seminoles. It was this. No, that was the Gators. The Gators were this, the Seminoles were this, okay? And I was always pushed to pick a side, and I wouldn't do it. I said Dallas Cowboys, and I got shot. But, gaping jaws. It's a picture of being, eaten up and swallowed. So, he says, God, and this is the phrase that's repeated that ties this section together. He says, in spite of all this, okay, this ought to get your attention, but it doesn't. And in spite of all this, that I am allowing this to happen and sending this, my anger has not turned away. And God's hand is still stretched out. There's more to come, okay? It's like I look at these phrases sort of as cliffhangers, to use a illustration of David in a movie, TV show. These are cliffhangers that where God is indicating, you haven't seen anything yet. I'm not done. And so this phrase is repeated each time in regard to certain attitudes and actions that Israel is doing. So that's the first one. In spite of all this, Isaiah 9, verse 12, the last part of that verse, his anger does not turn away, and his hand is still stretched out. More to come. The next section is verses 13 through 17. He says, yet the people do not turn back to him who struck them, nor do they seek the Lord of hosts. Okay? They hadn't learned their lesson. They don't turn back. They don't repent. They don't contemplate their spiritual situation, and perhaps they might be the cause of what's happening to them. That's not in their thinking. And then he says, so the Lord cuts off head and tail from Israel, both palm branch and bulrush in a single day. Now, who are the heads and who is the tails? You know, what's the head, what's the tail? Well, we're told the head is the elder and honorable man, and the prophet who teaches falsehood is the tail. Think about this. Who were the elders in the land? What were their responsibilities? Who were they? What? Yeah, they're the leaders throughout the districts, the cities, or whatever. The rulers of Israel are called, counselors, judges. They're called elders, and you would think that men of age and experience would have a different spirit within them. They would be able to see what others couldn't see, because they should be lathered with experience. That's why they become elders. That's why they're acknowledged as the leaders. But the very ones that are ruling and leading are the very ones who God holds accountable for the corruption of the people in northern Israel. So it's from the top down. It's very hard to go from the bottom up to change things. It's easier if you have someone that is righteous and godly, and then let that work down and influence the people of the land. But if you have a corrupt government, a corrupt leadership, then the people say, well, look what they're doing. Why can't I do that? Look what they're doing. So it's a double standard. And so eventually, the people, many will begin to engage in the corruption that they see in their leaders. So this is the situation, and God says, I'm going to cut down your leaders, the head, and then the prophet. The prophet. Who are the prophets? What's their role? What are they supposed to do? The prophet is the mouthpiece of God. They're the preachers of righteousness. They're the preachers of repentance and come back to God. Well, even in northern Israel, they had their own prophets. Not every prophet that's called a prophet is a true prophet of God. You had what was called false prophets. And so many times the leaders would turn to these pseudo-prophets and say, well, what do you say? Here's what Isaiah's been saying. This is the message we get for the southern kingdom. Well, what do you say? And the prophet, oh, don't worry about that. God says this. So it's kind of like what Paul says in 1 Timothy about people seeking, who have itching ears, seeking teachers, who teach myths and untruths about God. But because you don't want to hear this, you gravitate to someone who's speaking what you want to hear. Okay? Well, I think there's a place for that, of being affirmed in our beliefs, of course. But we should be open to hearing a word from God, and sometimes we're kicked in the shin by what the Bible teaches, and it's uncomfortable. So, what do? You kill the prophets. That's what Jesus said, isn't it? For so they persecuted the prophets before you. Well, that's the reason. I don't know. I guess it's human nature. I don't like what you said, even though it's the truth. I don't like how you said it, even though I needed it. You know, it's that's sort of human nature. So these leaders accumulate false prophets. You know, that's what a racket. You know, to come up there and say, "Hey, yeah, I'm a prophet." Get a job with the palace, with the king, become a part of his inner court, and you just tell him what he wants to hear. Well, that's not the function of the prophet, nor is it a function of any of us who teach or preach or live the Christian life. We're not here to give false messages or to affirm error. We want to affirm the truth, but we need to receive the instruction to help us align ourselves and our lives and our thinking with God's truth. That's not what's happening in northern Israel. So God's going to cut the head and the tail. Verse 16, for those who guide this people are leading them astray. Prophets, preachers, teachers can lead people astray. This is why James talks about teachers incurring a stricter judgment. You recognize that passage, don't you, in the book of James? It's important. We don't want to lead people astray. Now, this is not to discourage anyone from being a teacher unless you're wanting to teach your own thing. We're to communicate the will of God. Yeah. Yeah. And it's difficult because the epistles were written to correct error. All the epistles. Something's going on in the church. Timothy was told by Paul to fulfill his ministry. You know, he was Timothy was showing a little timidity, maybe because of age or certain things that had happened to him. But God through Paul was forcibly encouraging him to fulfill his ministry. Elders, I don't think we can have elders who can't teach. That's my personal view, because elders, according to Titus, should have the ability to convict the gainsayer. They should have the knowledge to address error in the congregation. It's a common practice. It's unfortunate in American churches that we deem a good businessman as being, or tantamount to being, a good elder. And so elderships in churches, a lot of them, have become like a board, mimicking, the board of a company in a sense. And that is not the practice or the form or the style of pastoring that God wants the elders to do. They're the shepherds. They're the pastors, yes. But yeah, he could do it, yeah. Yeah, I didn't mean to infer that one had to teach like a class or teach public, but they have to be able to correct. They can't. How can you be an elder if you're not able to correct or teach a person one-on-one or a group or whatever. So that is the emphasis that God places on these elders. Yeah, if you can't recognize error, so there's a high standard that we see in the qualifications of elders in 1 Timothy 3 and Titus 1 that, it's important, especially, it's mentioned in Titus 1 because there's a lifestyle and there's false doctrine coming, and they need men appointed as elders who can convict, correct what he calls the gangsayer, the one teaching error, making crooked the way of God. So this is the problem of northern Israel. So for those who guide this people are leading them astray, and those who are guided by them are brought to confusion. Leadership can create confusion. I mean, it's like we're past the COVID somewhat, but were you not confused during the COVID period about, what you should do? This will work. Why can't we do that? It was like a period of confusion, chaos. Well, if leaders are not focused on the right things to do or don't know themselves, it's one of the things that we encourage in my teaching with younger preachers is if you're unsure about something, then don't get up in the pulpit and preach it, because it will really be noticeable that you're unsure. It becomes more even exposed by your uncertainty, and any words to color it or counter it, is not going to help you. So maybe you put it aside and study it a little bit more until you gain some more clarity on the issue. So he continues, for those who guide the people are leading them astray, and those who are guided by them are brought to confusion. Therefore, the Lord does not take pleasure in their young men. This is unfortunate. See, what's he saying here? What's the problem? If you have the leaders who are teaching error, and are not doing the right things, and the people are confused and in chaos, then who's going to become the next leaders? The pool doesn't look very good, does it, to find leadership? If the pool of potential leaders, the young men, are corrupt, are not the kind of character of people that God is looking for, then it becomes a problem for the next generation. So God says, I reject the young men. Well, this is really a statement of accusation against passing down the faith to the younger generation. It's different from what John says in 1 John. He says, I write to the young men that they have overcome the evil one, I believe what he says. He compliments the young men in that epistle for their stance and faith and who they are in character. Therefore the Lord does not take pleasure in their young men, nor does he have pity on their orphans or their widows. Usually, the orphans and widows are at the top of God's concern. This is reversed. This is shocking, because orphans and widows are always top, because they represent a group that is often marginalized, overlooked, people not coming to the aid of, they don't find representation. But here, because of sin, all of the nation is going to be punished. It describes how bad the situation is. says, I will take no pleasure in their young men. I will have no pity. And the Lord doesn't have pity. That's sad. Orphans and their widows. For every one of them is what? Godless. So you're a widow. So you're an orphan. Usually, we would have compassion on that. God says the compassion is gone. All I see is ungodliness, wickedness. For every one of them is godless and evildoer, and every mouth is speaking what? Foolishness. So this is judgment against the foolishness of Israel. The foolishness began at the top, worked its way down to where the whole nation is at risk, spiritually, physically, financially. Everything is going to be receiving the wrath of God. Now we begin to understand a little bit why northern Israel fell. It's not like God's just a God that likes to throw lightning rods at different nations and people. No. God has allowed time for them to change their ways. He has sent messengers to northern Israel, and they're rejected. He has raised up messengers in northern Israel, and they have rejected them. And so there comes a time where the invitation is over. There's no more invitation for one to decide to come. Now it's judgment, and that's where we are with northern Israel. This would be bad enough, but what's the phrase? In spite of all of this, his anger does not turn away, and his hand is still stretched out. God's not through yet. He's not through. You thought things were bad. We're going to Act 3 now. They get really bad. So God is highlighting various areas of evil that spring from pride and arrogance. The next on the list is the cruelty of Israel. Their cruelty toward one another. And so in chapter 9, beginning in verse 18, for wickedness burns like a fire. Sort of the imagery in the book of James about the tongue, how it can set aflame an entire forest, how one uses their speech. He says, wickedness burns like a fire. It consumes briars and thorns. It even sets the thickets off the forest aflame, and they will roll upward in a column of smoke. So what's the image? You see it? You see a big, when we lived in Florida, there was, it happened on several occasions, but there was a fire. And Florida has what's called a lot of plantations and lots of trees and everything, but there was, periodically there would be a fire. You'd see, smoke, couldn't drive. When we went to Alaska, there had been a great fire. And so some of the sights we wanted to see, we couldn't see. I remember being in the bus, looking out the window, trying to see through the smoke. We were on a sightseeing, going to Mount Denali, and it was a bus ride. And for the first, I don't know, it seemed like, how long was that trip? The bus ride was too long. I mean, it was long, but it seems like half of it at least. We were looking, and over here would have been this, over here's this, but it was the smoke. We couldn't see anything, and then we got out and it cleared. We go, oh, okay, now we're starting to see some things. But that's the image that we're seeing in regard to how the northern kingdom is going to be. They're going to be like a blaze, and one looks from a distance, and they're seeing a pillar of smoke coming out of northern Israel. Verse 19, by the fury of the Lord of hosts, the land is burned up. That's what nations usually did when they invaded a land, conquered it. What did they do? They burned everything up. And the people are like fuel for the fire. No man spares his brother. They slice off what is on the right hand, but they still are hungry. And they eat what is on the left hand, but they are not satisfied. Each of them eats the flesh of his own arm. Manasseh devours Ephraim, and Ephraim Manasseh, and together they are against Judah. Now, the imagery of, almost like cannibalism is the fact that the people are against each other. It's what happens in churches when they split. It's that kind of thing. When they're pitted against each other, they're devouring one another. And it's from the standpoint spiritually, it's an act of cruelty against your own people, where you're taking advantage of someone else's plight, someone else's suffering, and then they take advantage when you're in the same situation, and they're biting and devouring one another. Cruelty is reigning because they don't have a soul anymore. You know what I mean by that, right? They don't have a heart of compassion. It's look out for number one, and if you have what I need, I'm going to get it. So things like that are being cited as the reason why God's coming in judgment. So we would think that's bad enough, right? No. In spite of this, his anger does not turn away, and his hand is still stretched out. We're not through yet. So we go to chapter 10, verses 1 through 4. We begin with a woe oracle. The next two, you got woe to Israel, and then you got a woe to Assyria. And when you have a prophetic woe, that's not good. That's not a woo. Ooh, it's a woe. Uh-oh. Ooey is what it is. Ooey. So, woe to those who enact evil statutes and those who constantly record unjust decisions. What's the sin? It's the sin of injustice. How is a nation built? What will the new king be? He will establish his kingdom in righteousness and justice. And to those who constantly record unjust decisions, so as to deprive the needy of justice and rob the poor of my people of their rights, so the widows may be their spoil, and that they may plunder the orphans. Now, what will you do in the day of punishment, and in the devastation which will come from afar? What's coming from afar? The Assyrians. This is the people that are coming from afar. To whom will you flee for help? And where will you leave your wealth? Can't take it with you, that which you're trusting in. Tear these things down, we'll build bigger buildings. Nothing remains but the crouch among the captives. The crouch among the captives, or fall among the slain. In spite of this, his anger does not turn away, and his hand is still stretched out. So there's judgment against the pride, against the foolishness, against the cruelty, and against the injustice. These are the things that are a summary as to why the northern kingdom is going to fall. This is the reason. Then God gives us a foretaste, continues to tell us what's going to happen in the future in regard to the nation of Assyria. He says, woe to the Assyrians, and the rod of my anger, and the staff of whose hands is my indignation. I send it against a godless nation. Who's the godless nation? Northern Israel. And commission it against the people of my fury, to capture booty or spoils, and to seize plunder, and to trample them down like mud in the streets. Yet it does not so intend, nor does it plan so in its heart, but rather it is its purpose to destroy and to cut off many nations. For it says, okay, God used Assyria to punish, but when Assyria comes down and punishes, they get the big head. They don't realize that they're dependent and accountable to God too. Well, I thought Israel's only accountable. No, everybody's accountable to God. He says, for it says, are not my princes all kings? Is not Kalino, like Carchemish, like Hamath, like Arpad, Samaria, like Damascus? These are places that Assyria will conquer. As my hand has reached the kingdom of the idols, whose given images were greater than those of Jerusalem and Samaria, shall I not do to Jerusalem and her images just as I have done to Samaria and her idols? So what Assyria is saying, and this is again referring to the days of Hezekiah, when Assyria comes down and sends the general out and says, y'all better, turn things over or you're going to be destroyed. And Hezekiah lays out the letter and prays to God, and then God intervenes, and we find Assyria humiliated, going back to their homeland, never to be seen anymore. This is what's being talked about here. So it will be that when the Lord has completed all of his work on Mount Zion and Jerusalem, he will say, I will punish the fruit of the arrogant heart of the king of Assyria and the pomp of his haughtiness. For he has said, by the power of my hand. See, this is the Assyrian king. By the power of my hand. Then he goes on in verse 15. Verse 15 is, God asks a question. Is the axe to boast itself over the one who chops with it? Does the axe say, I'm better than the one who does the chopping with it, who controls it? That's Assyria. Assyria is the axe. God is the one wielding it as punishment over his people, and yet the axe is saying, I'm better than anybody. I'm better than God. Is the saw to exalt itself over one who wields it? Then drop down to verse 16. Therefore, the Lord of hosts, the God of hosts, will send a wasting disease among his stout warriors. And under his glory a fire will be kindled like burning flame. And the light of Israel will become a fire and his Holy One a flame. Continue down, it says, verse 19, and the rest of the trees of his forest will be so small in number that a child could write them down. Destruction of Assyria. When does this happen? When Assyria comes to the neck of Jerusalem and talks to Hezekiah, which we're getting to. Hezekiah prays, God intervenes, and 180,000 soldiers are killed without anybody firing a shot from Judah. God sends a wasting disease, confusion, and then they go back. But the king of Assyria, writes about this event before he ultimately dies, that I had Hezekiah in a birdcage. Before, history shows that Judah was successful over over Assyria's threats against him. Interesting, isn't it? Well, I think so. Thanks for your time. What? Is it? I appreciate that.